So, Abigail, what we're here for today?
Oh, apparently you want to talk about boobs.
I don't want to talk about boobs. I just thought it'd be a really interesting subject, and I like being controversial.
You do. Welcome back to SENsible SENCO, and you'll notice we have mugs this time. So we didn't have any Baileys left, so this is a Baileys latte. Kenko Baileys latte. If you'd like to sponsor me, Kenko, hi.
If you'd like to sponsor us, Baileys, hi.
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 Gavin has his mug that he was bought for Christmas, which is highly appropriate because he does do this. And I love penguins, so I have penguins can't fly. I can't fly, therefore I am a penguin.
So, Abigail, what we're here for today?
Oh, apparently you want to talk about boobs.
I don't want to talk about boobs. I just thought it'd be a really interesting subject, and I like being controversial.
You do, and I don't want to talk about boobs because I think it is far too controversial. I have an opinion, as does pretty much everybody in the country, and I don't want to tread on toes and offend people, but I have been persuaded that I can talk about it in generic terms.
I don't care. I am going to be as controversial as I possibly can be with this.
We'll see.
We'll see. Just to start, I got very confused when I looked into this boob stuff. So I went to both the Ban the Boobs website and where the BBC News piece came from, and I'll put the links onto the piece for this. But the boob site seemed to say that there were 500 schools using isolation boobs, and 200 children had spent more than 5 consecutive days in isolation over the last year. Okay, so that's one. But the BBC was the one that they were quoting the information it came from, so check the BBC site. Freedom of Information Act, goes into 1,000 schools. 600 of them reply.
So I wonder if one of them said over 500 schools and nearly 600 reply.
No.
No, okay, fine.
No, I've taken it exactly as it is.
The wording exactly as it is.
The wording is exactly as it is on our screen that we're looking at the moment.
How many schools are in the UK? 23,000?
37,720.
Oh, thank you.
I knew that because I had to look it up to see what proportion this was actually out of. Okay. So, in 200 of those schools, so out of 600 that responded, in 200 in England,
a third of them,
they used isolation booths.
Okay.
12 were in Wales and 6 in Scotland, but none in Northern Ireland.
Okay.
While the majority of them had rules in place for children spending a maximum of 1, 2 or 3 consecutive days in isolation, which I still think is far too long to send people into isolation for, so the ban the boobs thing gets me on that one there. But there were 225 pupils in England and 1 in Wales that spent a whole week in isolation. That's a lot of hours, a lot of wasted time in isolation, as far as I'm concerned.
Okay, but I'm going to come at that from a different angle. What is the alternative to those particular 225 pupils being in that isolation room? And sometimes schools will use a isolation room as an alternative to a fixed term exclusion. So they wanted to fixed term exclude the child for whatever it was, persistent behaviour or violence to a member of staff or whatever it was, and it was perhaps a 5-day fixed term exclusion that they were considering, but they've taken into consideration the parental circumstances. The parents perhaps both work, they don't want to be inconvenient to that, they want to safeguard the child perhaps, they may well have committed the offence but they want to make sure that child's safe, and therefore they've gone, okay, we can't have you back in the classroom because what you did was so severe, we have to show other students that this would result in a fixed term exclusion, but
because of your circumstances
we are going to accommodate you in here.
Okay.
And actually, when you think of it in those terms, 225 pupils isn't that many.
No, and I don't think 225 pupils when you're looking at 200 schools is that many anyway. It's only near enough 1 in every school.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that it's right. And I certainly don't think children should be in there for more than a week. And of course, if they've spent 15 days in there as an alternative to fixed day exclusion, we have to remember that 15 days of fixed term exclusion would result in a governor's panel. And perhaps this is where it's getting a bit ambiguous, in that putting them into an isolation room is not sitting on exclusion figures.
So what you're saying is, if we weren't doing this, then we would be excluding more people because of the nature of
There
the
is a possibility that is where that figure comes from.
Right.
And it may, with the best will in the world, maybe the schools were doing the right thing for those children, those families.
Okay.
And I'm pretty sure that if we'd have put them out on a fixed term exclusion, then maybe we'd be having a whole different conversation here about vulnerable
Too
children.
many people being excluded from schools.
Which we have anyway, but go on.
Off rolling.
Yeah.
There goes some more. Let's go for some more really
How many
kind of
more
risque,
controversial terms shall we go for?
we'll go for.
But anyway, go on, tell us more about banning the boobs.
Banning for the boobs. They've got 3 main pieces that they want to campaign for. So the first one is removal of isolation booths in all schools. Now, mixed opinions on this one, from me at least. Booths, if used correctly, they can be a reasonable adjustment. Your SEND students might like it. Even your non-SEND students might like it. It gives people that quiet, safe space for them to kind of go in and reflect. A bit of mindfulness for them. It gives the child and the teacher an area to have a conversation without everybody else overhearing it, without the kind of bullying tactics that children to children do on a daily basis. And we all know that happens. And it can be used as a part of an agreed process with the child so that they can go off to this safe space when they feel like they need to in that time.
My SEN hat back on again. One of the schools I worked in, we had a room. There was actually a table in there, and there was a staff table in there, and then there was a row of what you would call booths at the other side of it. And I had some students who actually liked it in there. And the reasons they liked it was those booths were plain, there was no distracting displays. They didn't have to listen to teacher talk at the beginning of the lesson, they could just get their work, sit down, get on with it. There weren't many students in there, so they kind of had that support straight away from whoever was staffing it, whether that was a TA or whether that was a member of teaching staff or SLT even. So they got that almost instant guidance and support they needed. Yes, they had toilet breaks separate and break times separate to other students, but actually they liked that because it was quieter. Yeah. They weren't having to queue for the toilets at break time like everybody else does. And as far as lunch was concerned, yes, our students, their lunches were at a different time to the rest of the school, but actually it meant they didn't have to go in the dining hall and queue up with everybody else. And actually we used to take them in early, so they got first pick of lunch. So quite a lot of my students liked it in what are being called isolation booths. I'm still not saying that they are necessarily right, but for some students,
it was, for some people.
It was a reasonable adjustment. So for some students, you're making that almost reasonable adjustment to accommodate them. It's a bit of an odd conversation. This is why I kind of really don't want to do this. It's not just controversial, it's almost like I'm arguing with myself because I disagree with them, but at the same time I can see why
you can see a use
they
for
are
them,
so valuable for some of my students.
On an individual basis,
yeah.
there is a use for them.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I don't disagree with that whatsoever. So the second part of what they're campaigning for is a regulation and reporting of all children isolated for more than half a day. I kind of agree with that. And in the last video that we did about violence towards staff, we were talking about only until that risk is sorted. Until that risk has been assessed and managed, then this should only take hours. It shouldn't take days to be able to do that.
again, it goes back to what we are isolating that child into the booth for.
Yeah.
So I absolutely disagree with isolating a child for a uniform offence. I'm sorry, there is no law that says a child has to wear a school uniform. They are local policy.
And you're talking there about isolation as a punishment
for parents not being able to afford a uniform sometimes.
We can't
a
isolate
haircut.
for punishment. That's just ridiculous.
Yeah. So I disagree with them from that perspective. Where a child is persistently disrupting the education of others and they've been removed from the classroom, then yes, there should be a limit to that. And yes, I agree with you, that should be in terms of hours, not days. So for the remainder of that lesson possibly, and then yes, you can have another fresh start in your next lesson. However, if they continue it in that next lesson, do we keep playing that game, or do we turn around and go, actually, you know what, you've had 2 chances now, maybe you just need the rest of the day to chill out, guy, come on.
Well, surely if you get to the point where that happens, then that reasonable adjustment isn't working, and therefore you need to switch what your practice is.
Oh, absolutely. So something's not going right in the classroom for this child, so that needs to be examined. And very often that doesn't happen. And maybe it's that case of having that conversation with, actually, what on earth has happened today that means this child is erupting in the way that they are. And then the other part is, if we are using it as an alternative to a fixed term exclusion, then actually, yes, they may be in there for a couple of days, because we are supporting the family, we're supporting the child, we're providing an education rather than an exclusion.
Yeah.
So that's a bit different.
That is a bit different. Should we therefore be reporting all these ones where we are doing that kind of thing?
Yeah, because it's an informal exclusion in a way. You're excluding them from the classroom, so it's an exclusion.
Yeah, so we should be reporting that exclusion.
Yeah, maybe we should. Maybe, and whether that's an internal thing that just goes to your governors on a termly basis, or whether that's something that needs to be externally reported. The problem with it being externally reported is that there is a lot of flexibility in there for schools to adjust the figures. Whereas with a fixed term exclusion, that's very, very formal. It goes to your local authority and all the rest of it.
There's a process for that.
There's a process around that, and a permanent exclusion is a very definite process around that, and there's a law around that. This one would be quite difficult to monitor and adjust.
Yeah.
So I agree, there needs to be something. There needs to be some kind of tracking. And I have to put my SEN hat back on with, you know, if a child is being consistently put into booths or isolation or chill out room, it doesn't really matter, does it? We don't necessarily have to be talking about booth here. It could just be excluded from their classroom.
Yeah.
If that's happening consistently, then something isn't right in the classroom. At what point do we start investigating whether this is an SEN issue or a safeguarding issue or a training issue or something else that's going on? And unless we start tracking that information for internal use, you're not going to have that.
Yeah, there's no awareness of that.
But I'm not entirely sure how you would get that regulation to be able to externally report it. And I suspect what would end up happening is every school will have their own process of doing it, every school will have their own rules for doing it, and it'll be a bit like the SEN register. They'll be on it in one school, but they won't be on it in another.
Yeah. So the next one is funding to support schools in shifting from isolation booths to better practices. Schools always need more funding. Hey, bring on the money for the schools. Don't really care what it's used for. Bring more money into the schools.
So when we hit 1,000 subscribers and 4,000 hours of viewing, all of our proceeds from videos will be going back into schools. I'm not saying that that's going to get rid of booths, though.
Sorry, all the profits.
Oh, sorry, profits.
Not process. Let's get the financial terms right.
I'm not finance, I'm a SENCO!
I'm the finance director. All of the profits from our YouTube channel will go back into schools, and there'll be some kind of bidding process. We haven't kind of worked that piece there out. Or maybe we'll give free samples of our partners' products out. We're not really sure, but we're going to give it all back to schools because we're nice like that.
I want to be the Mrs. Beast SENCO. If you don't know who Mr. Beast is, go and check him out.
I don't get to be Mr. Peace because there's already one of those. So now I've just given my wife to some other strange bloke. As I said, schools always need more funding. And perhaps schools just need to change the way they use booths. Calling it an isolation booth just brings a lot of bad practices forward, I think.
Maybe, yeah. But at the end of the day, it's just a word, it's a term, it's a phrase. And I'm trying to think of the conversation on Facebook this morning, which was around Wave 1, 2, 3. Somebody had asked, Wave. I've been told off for using Wave 1, 2, 3. I've been told it's old terminology. And I responded with, my local authority uses targeted, supported, universal. And somebody else reported that they use elephant, dung, hamsters and chimpanzees. Basically, it's words that we use. Does it actually matter that we call them isolation booths? Does it matter if we call it a reflection pod? At the end of the day, it's actually what we are using them for, not the name of them. Because we could just argue, school is an offensive word, let's change the name of school.
Yeah, brilliant idea.
It's the same thing to me, it's the same argument.
Okay.
It's just a word, it's just a phrase. It just happens to be that we now have this negative connotation attached to it. And if we think about, and I will always come back to SEN because that's my experience and my knowledge. If we come back to how language has changed within SEN, if we go back 40 years ago, it was acceptable to use the word retard.
Yep.
If we go back 30 years ago, it was acceptable to use intellectually deficient. Mm-hmm. We wouldn't dream of using that terminology now. Isolation booth has perhaps lost its usefulness as a phrase, and just changing the name of it isn't enough. We actually need to define
what one
it
actually is. Yeah. And if we used them for well-being of the children and stuff like that, so massive impact for mental health, as I've said before. And I will continue saying mental health, the well-being of the children, all that kind of stuff can quite happily work in these nice safe spaces.
Absolutely. Thanks for watching, everybody. Hope that gave you something to think about.
Like and subscribe.